The recent rallies by white supremacists in Charlottesville and other cities have made it evident that we're a long way from a nation where, as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, people will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. For more on the resurgence of hate groups and how people of faith can counteract them, we welcome Reverend Jorge Morales, Conference Minister for the Illinois Conference of the United Church of Christ. We also welcome Reverend Myron McCoy, Senior Pastor of the historic First United Methodist Church at the Chicago Temple. How did you feel when you saw the protests at Charlottesville?
Well, I probably shocked. You, in the introduction, mentioned the hopes and dreams of Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King also made reference to building a beloved community. And certainly what we have seen recently in the growth of KKK groups, neo-Nazis and others in defense of the Confederacy does not point to building a beloved community or a community that is seeking to be united. And it's a troubling time to see all those things.
I would say that deeply disturbed. I can think back to 2008 when President Obama was elected and how many newscasters and others wanted to suggest that we were a colorblind society now. And so I think we have been on the long road of stepping back to much of our ugly past. It's deplorable. Yes. When you think about it, and what's even more inconceivable is that this is being done and in some ways encouraged by the present administration that we have in place.
One of the things that I find deeply hopeful is that in many of those demonstrations, Caucasian people of good conscience, moral values, have stepped forward. And in some of these instances, a good number of them, what I've seen has been a majority of white folks of good Christian value who are stepping forward and denouncing that type of negative behavior.
So with that in mind, do you think this resurgence and increased visibility is really an aberration that we can get past, or is this a trend?
Probably that's an underlying discontent within our nation. Many people are not, let's say, sharing in the American dream like they thought they could or would. And there are elements in our country that have made it, well, you're not sharing in this because it's related to those other people.
How long this type of rhetoric from the White House continues is in part dependent on whether or not there is other leadership of moral value and character, moral fiber, that can step forward and say, this is enough. I often use the words to communicate what has happened, to raise the question, how much can power do? How much damage can be done by power or an individual in a position of power? However, what is saddening is that that individual has an enormous following. People who are not willing to move. Obviously, from my own perspective, and I think even from a Christian perspective, I think a good-minded Christian is a person who has a high level of consciousness and awareness about the ideals that we advocate, the ideals that we preached about. And to find a large population of people who are obviously somewhere else is disheartening. It's difficult to address. And also the fact that if we individualize it, where do we find? Who's in line? Where are those that can provide the moral leadership?
So what does that look like? Is it possible to have dialogue with people who feel like they have been disadvantaged through affirmative action, people who are in support of Confederate monuments? Is that what leadership looks like, or does it look like something else?
Well, certainly it's some of that, but it is saying wrong is wrong. Mm-hmm. There were certainly a number of people in the marches, but too many in our leadership, including some who identify themselves as Christian, have really been encouraging the kind of actions and condoning without calling it out as wrong.
I believe that there's always the possibility of dialogue. Mm-hmm. We certainly cannot confront hate with hate or provoke more hatred and bitterness. And there is the question of the fact that leadership has to show enough maturity to be able to enter into real dialogue. We live in a nation that has yet need to learn how to enter into real dialogue and conversations of issues of race. And what we are facing today is a reality that this divisiveness challenges us to be in dialogue with individuals who you can enter into dialogue with. Certainly, I don't think confrontation would help. Mm-hmm. But I'm also aware that it takes a certain level of maturity to be able to sit in a room or to be in a setting where people can have honest, forthright conversation one with the other. But if we cannot do that, then we are in a set state of things. There should always be an openness to dialogue, and we can grow with one another, and we can seek to put ourselves in the position of the other. I want to be able to comprehend the passion of the Federalists or those who defend statues that contribute to the reminder of their history. But I want my history to also be honored and recognized. And unfortunately, we do live in a nation where we have too many heroes that have played a role in oppression, dehumanization, genocide, segregation, and rejection of people because of their difference. And that is a challenge for this nation.
I guess, unfortunately, where we're at a time where we're connected in so many ways, we are disconnected as an American people. I was reading something recently that suggested that there were very few areas in the country where the election results, the last presidential election, where they were contested with less than 10% of the votes, meaning that people are geographically organized where we're in kind of a group think And so we find a lot of support with folk who think like we do. So what it means for the church is that we have to find avenues in which we get people to cross lines, to talk to one another, to discover that we have more in common as human beings than we think we do, and that there are persons who are feeling the onslaught of not experiencing the American dream on all corners of the earth, and on all corners of our country, and how do we begin to share and talk together and find a path forward together instead of in our own separate camps.
Are there particular opportunities for faith leaders and faith communities to engage in that kind of work that perhaps political leaders have less opportunity or less of a calling to do?
I think there are lots of opportunities. There are lots of people who are willing to step forward and rebuke, and I think more than rebuking, people who are interested in real dialogue. People of color in this nation would have not made the advances that we have made if we have not found solidarity with others, and if we did not have advocates to advocate for greater human decency, equality, liberty. And I do think there's a great hope for that. I think we need to encourage that hate be denounced wherever it happens. I think that we need to encourage dialogue. I think we need to encourage conversation. And certainly I think we in the faith community bear a major responsibility for holding up the moral values and for being prophetic at a time like this. I would certainly love to have hear more voices standing up. And in many cases, I think part of the challenge is that we got to help people do that in the communities where they are, in the silos where they are. Mm-hmm. I was talking to a friend recently who said, well, it's hard to find a person who admits that they are racist. There are far too many people who argue that racism doesn't exist. And so any person of good conscience should be challenged. Okay, so you're not a racist, you're anti-racism, so what are you doing? What steps are you taking in your own community? You don't have to march in the inner city, you don't have to carry a banner, but certainly you can engage your own neighbors, your own family in conversations about these issues. And the sense that, particularly from a perspective of faith, we are called to be the body of Christ and to envision the beloved community, in the words of Martin Luther King, where all can have a part in which all are included.
When you talk about is there a difference between politicians and the faith community? I think there is no difference. The difference is probably in moral leadership, fiber. We as religious leaders ought to have the moral religious fiber within us to cross lines, to meet brothers and sisters who live in different neighborhoods, who might be of another faith community than me. Many of our politicians at this point are being demonized if they are not towing the party line. And what it says to me is, as faith leaders, we need to help free people up to not succumb to those party lines. So even though we do not get into supporting candidates, endorsing candidates per se, as individual citizens, we see it as people taking responsibility to make sure that their values are being enacted by the leadership that they elect.
How should people of faith counter hate groups? Not just people, I think we talked a little bit about people who maybe are on the right and somewhat supportive and feel a little bit wronged, but when we talk about, but don't identify as neo-Nazis or don't identify as Ku Klux Klan. How do we specifically respond to hate groups? Is there, yes, calling wrong? Is there anything else that faith communities should be doing to be active?
Well, certainly I think one of the things that we definitely need to do in every instance is to be supportive of the victims of hate. We have to be supportive of them. There are a lot of people who feel that hate groups are well organized and that the numbers are growing. There's a number of researches that point to a substantial number of hate groups that are returning into being after they had gone away, and new groups that are being organized. I'm one of the people who believes that we have to organize against hate. And I'm one of the people who believes that through organization and building of community, we grow a greater level of consciousness, awareness, solidarity. And of course, as I mentioned before, and you asked, we have to use every avenue for dialogue where we can find one another, and that's different than having conversation. It's a dialogue is that instance in which we hear one another, where we have the tolerance and the maturity to hear diverse points of view, to hear the opposing point of view, and to try to take the position and understand the position of the other. So those are, I think, are significant ways. And as Pastor McCoy has stated, we have to appeal to our moral values, Christian character or faith character today, because I do believe that communities of faith, of all faith expressions, need to jointly denounce hatred and violence.
One of the things that we can do as faith communities is certainly talk about the issues of love, how love crosses boundaries, it's still pretty much true in this country that the worship hours are the most segregated hours. And so we need to be working on our individual communities in terms of where we worship and how they embrace others, how they're exposed to others. But I think one of the positive elements of the Charlottesville was to see the faith leaders of all different denominations and different faith stripes standing together. And I think that's what we have to do. But part of it comes in just knowing each other and seeing that we share the same values, and then spreading that knowledge instead of keeping it within.
Are there specific examples going on with your congregations that you could share along these lines?
I'm wonderfully blessed to be serving in a congregation that has a great deal of mixture within it. And part of even having, it's one thing for them to be present, but to encourage dialogue even within the body, I think, is we're still pushing that we must know each other, we must engage in the issues, we must respect one another's cultures. We must learn about one another's culture. We try to engage with other faith communities beyond Christian. And I think one example of that would be what we do with housing Silk Road Rising within the bounds of our church building, where it's an opportunity to struggle with issues that may not be a part of our own culture, but certainly a part of the society of which we are a part.
And that's a theater group.
That's a theater group at the church.
Yep.
Well, in the United Church of Christ, one of the things recently that has been done is curriculums have been developed. People have been trained to address white privilege. And of course, we understand that even that terminology in some places
can be a little inflammatory sometimes.
Yeah, it's not well received. But there is, I think, some value in calling things what they are. And so now we are about the task of trying to engage people in settings that are outside of their own silos, outside of their own community, to have the kind of dialogue that I think is necessary to be had. We need to do that more effectively in the religious community. That was a challenge when we were basically holding conversations on race. I guess the conversation now has to change somewhat to holding conversations on preventing hate and violence and on building the beloved community. And that I think is a challenge. That's why I think people have to be challenged to, if they want to stand up to their values, be provided a means to do something in their own setting. Even in those settings where there's not the racial, cultural diversity. If you really value with integrity, building a beloved community, living in love with one another, honoring the values of the Quran or the gospel, you got to find ways to do it in your own community. And it's the responsibility of some of us in positions of leadership in the church to be able to provide the tools and facilitate the means for that to happen.
Can you share with us a little bit about the partnership between the Chicago Temple and the Chicago Urban League?
Well, we are engaged in a conversation with the Chicago Urban League and the church to get different frames of reference. It's located in a different part of the city. So the idea being that we want to, that's one conversation, and we ought to have many more like it, encouraging people to move beyond their comfort zone. So in this case, the conversations are being held here at the church and also at the Urban League headquarters in the Bronzeville community. I think this is a model of the kinds of things that need to happen in communities and with churches as we cross boundaries of difference. That's true both racially. It's true as we're dealing in the community with issues of the Jewish community is being threatened right now, and it's true with the LGBT community and Muslim community and many Hispanic immigrants as it relates to DACA. How do we have those kind of meaningful conversations? And it gets back to what I said earlier. We have to discover that we share common interests and our values. If we do dialogue, we'll discover that we have more in common than we have in terms of differences.
And what did the events with the Urban League look like?
They looked very different. One we may have talked about how it's different between white and black or different racial groups. We looked at the difference of age, age dimensions in a community, so that baby boomers and the silent majority might think differently than millennials. How do we learn to talk with one another? So the issue of difference is not only one of race and culture, but it is of economic class, it is of age. And so as a church, we need to be encouraging those conversations so that we don't pit ourselves against one another, which seems to be where we are at a nation, being pitted against one another.
Thank you so much, Reverend Morales and Reverend McCoy. I'm Liz Dunn for the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.